Hey everyone, welcome back. So yes, the lights are back on in Washington. The federal government is open again. Federal workers will get their paychecks. National parks are unlocked. The airports stop having to reroute around staff shortages. Markets breathed a sigh of relief. Good news, right? Sure, on the surface. But before we clap this as a victory for governing, let's not forget what actually just happened. Because this end is not a solution. It's a timeout. And the way it ended tells you everything you need to know about what's broken in American politics. Today, I want to walk you through three things. First, how this particular shutdown actually ended, the deal mechanics, and the real compromise that made the lights come back on. Second, one of the more surreal chapters of the whole thing, lawmakers literally racing to make it back to Washington, and the theater they made of it on social media. And third, the deeper implications, the reality of the political bargain, the institutional rot behind the budget process, and what the public's eroding trust really means for our politics. Stick with me. I promise this is worth your time. Let's clear the stage. How did the shutdown end? In the most prosaic terms possible, Congress passed a clean continuing resolution, a short-term funding bill that keeps spending at current levels and buys time. It doesn't settle the big fights about priorities or long-term budgets. It just says, okay, we'll keep the lights on for now. Usually, these CRs run for a few weeks or a few months. This one extends funding through early next year. Here's what matters about that. A clean CR is, politically speaking, the classic Washington Band-Aid. It's a temporary measure, deliberately vague, that lets both sides declare victory and avoids the immediate pain of being blamed for services going dark, which, in the court of public opinion, is a disaster. Why did both sides accept it? Because the political math made it the least bad option, or Republicans, particularly House conservatives who had pushed hard for spending cuts and strict fiscal rules. The calculus changed when public sentiment turned sour. Polls showed that even though many Americans are worried about federal spending and deficits, they overwhelmingly dislike shutdowns. Voters don't like parks closed, they don't like air travel delays, and they don't like federal employees missing paychecks. Rightly or wrongly, when the country sees chaos, they point fingers, and incumbents pay the price. For Democrats, the calculation was straightforward. Don't be the party that presided over an economic shutdown that hurts families right before the holidays. They had priorities: healthcare subsidies, housing assistance, climate and energy investments. But all that can be fought over in the next round. For now, they needed to avoid the headline, "Government closed by Democrats," or "Children lose benefits." A short-term CR protected them from that narrative. Now, 2 points of clarity. First, the political payoff for a clean CR is immediate. It calms the markets and quiets town halls. Second, the policy payoff is nil. The major clashes, who pays for what, who gets which program, and what the fiscal strategy will be, remain unresolved. The CR simply punts the hard decisions forward. That's the reality. A short reprieve, not a resolution. Now for the part that has a little bit of comedy and a lot of theater. When it became clear that House leadership needed every member in D.C. for the vote on the continuing resolution, members did things you don't normally associate with people in Congress. I mean this literally. They ran, they flew, they drove, they motored, whatever it took to get back to the Capitol. Here are a few of the standout examples. Wisconsin Congressman Derek Van Orton famously rode a motorcycle across long stretches to get back to Washington. Reports noted he spent nearly 17 hours on his bike because commercial flights were limited or canceled. It's dramatic, visual, and frankly, makes a better social post than delayed flight. Other members, like Trent Kelly from Mississippi and Rick Crawford of Arkansas, opted to drive across the night to make it back in time. They shared photos of gas stops, exhausted faces, and hurried press statements. On the other side of the aisle, there were staffers calling mandate style, "We need you here now." Members who were vacationing, at home, or on the campaign trail booked last-minute flights or scrambled onto whatever was available. Private jets were pressed into service. Some members were seen storming through airports, badges flashing, phone held to ear, barking instructions. And as all of this happened, this tense reclaimed transit theater, social media lit up. Videos, selfies, short clips. "I'm coming back to save the people. I'm turning my vacation around. I won't let the other side hold the government hostage." Let's pause on that for a second. These are powerful images. They show commitment. They show urgency. They show sacrifice, the sort of symbol that makes an emotional appeal. But here's the thing. The optics rarely match the reality. Many of these lawmakers weren't rushing back because they were the only person who could keep the lights on. They were rushing back because someone needed to be physically present to vote, and because being physically present made a social media narrative. It's a show, and the show served both a political and a personal purpose. Think about it. A video of a lawmaker sprinting through an airport says, "I put my job before my vacation." That's a strong narrative for voters. But what does it actually mean in policy terms? Almost nothing, except that the member cast a vote. Why does this matter? Because it's emblematic of how incentives in modern politics push for performance over policy. In an era where attention is currency, the spectacle of "I rushed back to save America" pays political dividends. It generates retweets, gets coverage on cable news, and drives fundraising. Meanwhile, the substantive compromise, the kind of negotiating that requires patience, secrecy, and trade-offs, gets minimized because it's not as clickable. So yes, lawmakers did some wild things to make it home in time. And yes, they posted it. And yes, that mattered politically. But we should look at the theater and say what it is. Theater. This is where I'll be blunt. A lot of the drama was about saving reputations and fundraising narratives, not saving the functioning of government. When you watch a member post a selfie with the caption, "Back in DC to vote to reopen the government," think two things at once. First, appreciate the image. It's powerful. Second, be skeptical. Ask why they weren't in town making the deal weeks earlier. The truth is that most members have staff, travel budgets, and systems that let them be in DC during crucial votes. And yet, every year, we get this rush-home spectacle. Is it genuine dedication? Sometimes. But often, it's a kind of political theater that works toward a particular end. Convincing an audience, donors, base voters, swing constituencies of your virtue. There's also an uglier side. Some members clearly use these moments to position themselves for primary fights or media attention. If you're an ambitious House member, a viral clip of you arriving breathlessly to save the country can be more valuable than quietly negotiating an obscure technical fix. So when I see a member drive overnight or hop a last-minute plane and then sit motionless for 4 hours while negotiations continue, I don't see heroism. I see PR. A politician who is more concerned with the image of heroism than the messy work of compromise is part of the problem. And let's be honest, this performative culture favors style over substance and rewards posturing over problem solving. It reshapes incentives in Washington, not for better governance, but for better branding. All right, now back to my 3-point analytical structure. First, realistic politics. The deal reopens the government, but does not resolve the underlying fiscal standoff. At its core, the battle is about priorities. Republicans, especially the House conservatives, want spending restraint, cuts, and a stronger focus on deficit reduction. They call for limits on discretionary spending, reforms to entitlement growth, and sometimes policy riders that curtail what they see as wasteful federal programs. Democrats prioritize the continuation or expansion of social programs, healthcare subsidies, housing assistance, investments tied to climate and green energy, child tax credits, and support for low-income families. For them, cutting these would be a direct political and moral loss. A clean CR doesn't decide between these priorities. It keeps spending at current levels, neither an adequate reduction nor a significant expansion. In short, the CR moves the political fight forward in time. Why did Republicans accept it? Partly because the political costs of letting the shutdown drag on were too high. Midwestern swing voters and suburban voters, the kinds who decide elections, grow intolerant of the chaos. Those are the voters Republicans need to win. The optics of closed parks and unpaid workers were politically poisonous. Why did Democrats accept it? Because they needed to avoid getting blamed, and because time helps them consolidate alliances and plan the next move. When the parties reconvene to hammer out a long-term deal, Democrats will still push for more social spending and protections. The key political point: this short-term fix was a concession to public pressure and political prudence, not a policy victory. Now to the bigger structural point, the institutional dysfunction. This is not a new problem. Since the 1980s, the U.S. has had many shutdowns, and this is true. Shutdowns are baked into the modern budget rhythm. Why did that happen? A few reasons. 1. Budget rules that emphasize deadlines. Congress sets annual spending deadlines, and those deadlines used to serve as forced coordination points. But when polarization increased, those deadlines became leverage points. Deadlines are now weapons. 2. Legislative fragmentation. The budgeting process in practice has fragmented. Instead of a single, coherent appropriation path, the process is filled with riders, amendments, and separate bills that each become negotiation flashpoints. The appropriation bills are no longer straightforward technical spending bills. They are ideological surrogates. 3. Partisan primaries and incentives. Primary voters are often more ideologically extreme than general electorate voters. This pushes House members to stake out extreme positions early, making compromise politically costly. 4. Media and fundraising incentives. Spectacle generates donations. If you take a theatrical hard line, you can raise money from an energized base. If you quietly negotiate a deal, you might anger activists with donation power. 5. Erosion of norms. A lot of governance depends on norms, informal agreements not written into law, but shared among actors, like we don't use shutdowns as leverage. Those norms have eroded. Once norms break, institutions struggle to self-correct. The cumulative effect is a structural dysfunction. The system is not broken in the sense of being dead. It's broken in the sense that its normal operating assumptions no longer hold. What's the fix? Stronger midterm budget constraints, independent spending frameworks, or even commissions to set spending lines. Those are potential solutions and worth discussing seriously. But institutionally, those reforms are politically hard because they require the very parties that benefit from the current system to cede advantage. Now, onto the psychological and social parts, and here the data is blunt. According to the Pew statistic, in the 1960s, roughly 80% of Americans said they trusted the federal government to do the right thing most of the time. That number is now somewhere around 20%. That's staggering. Why does this matter beyond a headline statistic? Because democratic governance depends on trust to operate. When voters trust the institutions and those who run them, they accept slow processes and compromise. When trust erodes, people move toward more immediately gratifying and simpler political solutions, and that's fertile ground for demagogues, polarization, and populist anger. Shutdowns, debt ceiling standoffs, public bickering, and the literal images of lawmakers racing home, all these things diminish trust. People don't just lose faith in a given leader, they lose faith in the system's capacity to solve problems. The cumulative impact is also generational. Young people who see repeated dysfunction might decide that politics doesn't work for them, leading to disengagement or extremist alternatives. Older voters might become cynical and swing toward candidates who promise decisive action, regardless of the costs of that action. Put bluntly, recurring shutdowns feed political alienation, and that alienation feeds political instability. That's a feedback loop that erodes democratic resilience. Here's my summary. Short term, the reopening is the right move. It prevents immediate economic harm and spares federal employees and citizens the worst of the shutdown's effects. Medium term, it buys political breathing room. That's valuable. Time lets cooler heads calculate, and for some policy winners, it's an opportunity to regroup. Long term, no, it doesn't resolve the fundamental issues. The structural tensions, different spending priorities, competing fiscal philosophies, electoral incentives that reward brinksmanship remain unresolved. The key risk is that future shutdowns will become normal. With each cycle, trust falls further, and the incentive structure for brinkmanship solidifies. If we never change the rules or the incentives, the shutdown pause will be the recurring instrument of governance, an ugly but accepted way of negotiating. A few things we should keep our eyes on. 1. Will states or courts start to undermine national bureaucratic stability? If federal inaction gets bad enough, states push harder into policy areas. That fragmentation increases volatility. 2. Will voters punish the party seen as responsible? Historically, yes. The public tends to punish the side perceived as obstinate. So political calculations will keep shaping these choices. 3. Will reform come from within or from crisis? Often, heavy institutional reform arrives following crisis. But reform requires leadership willing to cede short-term advantage. Reforms like mid-term budget constraints and independent spending frameworks deserve a quick expansion. Stronger multi-year budgeting. Forcing a binding multi-year budget could reduce year-to-year brinksmanship. It would force the parties to negotiate longer-term trade-offs and make short-term political theater less effective. Independent Budget Commission. A bipartisan or nonpartisan commission could set baseline spending targets and present a unified recommendation. That wouldn't eliminate politics, but it would shift the baseline and create an anchor for negotiation. Automatic continuing resolutions with limits. Instead of the government full shutdown, a default low-level funding mechanism could prevent the catastrophic effects while still forcing negotiation on the margins. Primary reform. Move toward open primaries or ranked choice systems to lessen the ideological skew of primary voters and incentivize candidates to appeal to a broader base. Campaign finance changes. The current fundraising incentives feed spectacle, reducing the effectiveness of viral outrage as a revenue source could change the incentives for performative theater. Each of these is politically difficult, but that's the point. If the status quo creates perverse incentives and recurring harms, then difficult reforms are the real price of long-term stability. When the government reopens and things look normal again, it's very easy for the media cycle to move on, and the public's attention will too. But that's exactly what makes the problem so dangerous. The resumption of normal services should not be treated as a victory lap. It should be treated as an intermission. If we applaud the reopening without demanding structural fixes, we'll be back here in a few months, watching lawmakers sprint home again for the camera. That's the final takeaway. Reopening is necessary. Reform is essential. If you're someone who cares about governance, not just the spectacle, don't let this moment pass as everything's fine. It isn't. The government is open again. Good. The fight behind the reopening is unresolved. Bad. The spectacle of politicians racing home was real, and so was the performative motive behind it. The real problem is institutional. The budget process and perverse political incentives Keep creating moments like this. Real, painful reforms are the only way to stop the cycle. One last thought to leave you with. Democracy isn't just the moment things get done. Democracy is the rulebook that keeps us from being ruled by the moment. If we keep treating the rulebook as optional, the moments will keep getting worse. Thanks for watching. If you like this breakdown, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. See you next time.